So thank you for taking the time to join us. And why don't we dive in? I think you've written an extraordinary book, one that is both incredibly personal, but at the same time, I think incredibly important in terms of the gay rights movement, human rights in general, diversity, all of those dimensions. As a kicking off point, why did you write it?
Well, good morning. I wrote it because someone eventually persuaded me by total persistence that I should write it. But I was thinking about the book. I thought it was important to write a book which did the following things. First, it stopped anyone getting in the same mess as I got into. It would be a tragedy, in my view, if someone repeated the mistakes that I'd made. Secondly, to give people a sense that there are plenty of role models out there in business, in corporate life, where they could see some of themselves, not all of themselves, but role models tend to give people confidence to be themselves, and for good and for bad. Thirdly, I wrote it to write a letter to all the straight people in the world. I wanted to write a letter which said, you've really got to think about this, and the straight people are very important, the allies are critical, because if we want to make it possible for people to be themselves in corporate life, to be authentic, then all the help comes from straight people, and that is most of the leaders in business. And the fourth reason I wrote it was a very simple observation. I kept looking around for role models, and I said there's got to be a gay CEO somewhere. So I looked at the S&P 500, and I saw there were no out gay CEOs. So I then looked at the rest of the list, and when I wrote the book, you had to go down to S&P 723 before you found an out gay CEO. And I said, that's odd. It's statistically improbable, I think that something's wrong. Either people are in the closet, or gay people have been discriminated against, or maybe gay people have just opted out. They haven't got into the business of wanting to go to the top of a company. And there are no role models. So I said, we've got to write it, and let's see what happens after I've written it.
Fantastic. So take us back to May of 2007, which is in many ways the kicking off point of the book. And that was the time when the press made it explicit that you are gay. You were outed in a very dramatic way. Tell us about what was going through your head, your heart, during that time, and what you describe as being somewhat eaten alive by the media vultures of the time. Just take us back then.
Well, the story starts before May the 1st, 2007, which is Labor Day. I thought I had a very interesting and important moment to do something important, but we'll come back to that. Because I'd become a figure of a lot of public interest during my time as running BP. BP came from a very small company to a very large company, and it tried to do all sorts of things rather differently. And during that time, I was always in the closet. Actually, I'd been in the closet since I grew up in the 60s. In the 60s, being gay was effectively a recipe for being blackmailed or bullied, because in most parts of the world, including the UK, it was illegal for people to undertake a homosexual act. So I stayed in the closet. My late mother, who was an Auschwitz survivor, always said to me, 2 rules of life will preserve you. Number 1, never tell anyone a secret, because it's no longer a secret. And number 2, never be a visible member of a minority, because when the going gets tough, minorities are always hurt. And from her point of view, that was exactly correct. So this was drilled into me. So I built a couple of lives. I felt like James Bond. I had a life which had no sexuality in it, and I had a gay life, and I kept these very separate. And as I got more and more well known, it was more and more difficult to keep the two lives separate and actually to have a gay life. So I decided to reduce risk, and by reducing risk, I increased risk gigantically. I said the only way I can meet someone is through an escort website, which I did, and I built a sort of relationship with a guy who I met. It fell apart, and I thought nothing of it. And at the beginning of 2007, I got a phone call from a well-known newspaper, Mail on Sunday, the Daily Mail, which said that they covered this sort of thing, which said, we've bought a story from your former boyfriend about your entire life, and we have the following 29 or 39 questions we'd like you to answer. Friday evening, published on Sunday, a classic trick. So I decided that I'd say, this is my life, why should someone advertise my privacy? So I stopped the story being published by taking out what's called a super injunction with lots of lawyers and all sorts of things like that. And in so doing, I made a fatal error. Because I couldn't bring myself to say where we'd met, I lied on where we'd met. And I corrected it a few days later, but it was a very bad thing. So this lawsuit sort of carried on. I couldn't tell anyone about it. Be contempt of court if I did. And lo and behold, eventually I lost my last appeal, and I was told that the story would come out on May the 1st. So by that time, I'd been sort of almost preparing myself in some ways, but you can't really prepare yourself, to say that my life was really about to change, involuntary change. And so everything would change. So I resolved that I would resign from BP because it was embarrassing for BP, and the board is terribly conservative. And so on May the 1st, I had a letter delivered to my chairman, resigning, and I walked out of the front door of BP, walked out of BP for the last time, into a huge throng of press. I mean, it was all over the world. And for 3 days, I was hounded by paparazzi on motorbikes and long lenses and stuff like that. So eventually, that all stopped, and I went away, and I thought about my life, and I said, absolutely everything has to change, which it did. So I stopped doing everything I was doing and said, let's start again. And one of my wise friends said, that'll be fine, because all this nonsense with the press, it is, the dogs bark and the caravan moves on. So you're no longer a story, which was true.
So one of the things that you do, I think, incredibly well in the book is to communicate that sense of fear and anxiety as you were grappling with all of these issues. And I think it's an interesting perspective to share with the group, the kind of mental process happening, because you were not actually even truthful to your lawyer to some extent. Correct? Was there anyone who knew? Was anyone looped into what you were thinking, feeling?
I think not really, no. I mean, I kept it all to myself. I mean, in my head, I had built a whole structure of fears. Fears that if I came out, I wouldn't be taken as seriously as if I didn't come out. Fears that I'd lose my friends, they'd sort of cross the street when I walked past them. Fears that people would not do business with me, that clients, suppliers would all think I was rather trivial, and since I was in a very geopolitical business, that all the heads of state would say, you disgust me, we don't want you, and everything would fall apart. So I'd convinced myself about this, and as a result, I protected the secret, according to my mother's instruction, tell nobody. So I did that, and of course, when you debate with yourself with nobody else, you rarely get the right answer, because you're always right. And so it's difficult to get out of this box of fears. And of course, when it happened, I realized that all of these were sheer and utter nonsense. It wasn't true that I lost my friends. If anything, I made more. I didn't lose my business contacts. They stayed the same. I was thinking to myself, maybe after I published this book, or after I came out, I would be made persona non grata in some countries in the world where it's illegal to promote homosexuality. Not at all. So nothing kind of changed, except I changed a lot, because I now could be more of myself.
Yes.
And I think I was better at connecting with people than I used to be. One of my bosses, from the early days, has a great wife, and we had dinner in San Francisco recently. She said to me, she said, you know, I always knew there was something up with you because you defined the word reserved even for an Englishman. There was something really deeply reserved, and that was right.
Well, and you talk a lot about that as well, the sort of liberating notion of coming out, the burden of being in the closet. So related, and I know your mother was incredibly important to you. She was not with you during the unfolding of a lot of this, but had clearly played an important part, I mean, as all mothers do, but she was also your surrogate partner as well, in that she lived with you, you went to a lot of events and those sorts of things with her. What advice do you think she would have given you, or how would she reflect on this whole thing?
It's impossible to say, because this is, you know, all other things being equal, hypothetical question. But I think people are rarely change deeply held views which form part of their character, where they've come through something as terrifying as the Holocaust.
Yes.
So I doubt very much whether she changed her view that people aren't reliable with secrets. You don't tell them. And just don't get in the way of the majority when something goes wrong. Yeah. Because, in the words of one of my other friends, advances with minorities always require constant vigilance. It is not something you can simply say, it's done. It's not done. And she would say that, I think.
But also be happy, proud that you've made it to the other side.
As a pragmatist, as a practical person, of course.
Yes.
Of course.
Yes.
Of course.
So I actually want to go back to something that you mentioned earlier, which the notion of being a spy in training. There's a great quote from the book that where you say, "The longer I kept up my charade, the more successful I became. At times I found my double life thrilling, and I thought conducting it somehow improved my skill at sensing danger, as if I were a spy in training. I persuaded myself that this was the right way to live." So how do you reflect on this observation today? What lessons do you think it provides gay professionals who are going through the same types of issues?
Well, first, I hope no one gets into the same position of having two lives like this. I hope that they can bring them together, because there's such a hidden cost. But I think one of the things it does is when you've got two lives, you get very flexible, you get very attuned at reading danger and reading people very quickly. It's a skill which comes just by observation of what they do after you've met them. And then you go back and, I think, correlate it to the first impression. And you build this database because it's a matter of survival.
Yes.
As opposed to a matter of luxury or academic interest. So it teaches you this, and it teaches you to be much more accurate about sizing people up. You get it wrong sometimes, but it does do that. Now, whether that is a skill, I'm always very reluctant to say that there are skills that go with sectors. It may or may not be a skill that LGBT people have, but I think it's a skill that people who are threatened certainly develop, certainly develop.
Well, and also a skill that can be very useful in the context of business.
It can be.
And you even make reference to that there are, and many of the people you interview, the book is wonderful in that it provides a pretty broad sweep of industries, business, sports, law, and a number of very successful people, some of whom are still in the closet despite the current context. But
Yes, but they masquerade with false names.
Right.
In the book. There aren't that many of those.
Right. But they talk about some of the advantages actually of having to negotiate this double life and the potential impact that it has on their success in the workplace.
Yes. They are all would admit that they're not as engaged in what they're doing as they might have been had they been able to be themselves at work.
Yes.
And I think that's the big point, the business point about why coming out is good for business. Engaged teams always perform better. There are tons of studies which show that, and companies with engaged teams have a premium outperformance compared with the average. It's enormous. It's sort of 2% a year over 20 years for the companies that genuinely have engaged teams. And LGBT people feeling safe to come out and being part of a company in its fullest sense are a leading indicator, I think a litmus test of how people are engaged in a company.
Yes. And clearly an important part of that is mentorship and role models, which you led off with. And I thought it was curious you share a story about Frank Rickwood, who was your boss here in New York, and that was a pivotal point in your career. This is an also closeted gay professional, and again, it's always hard to sort of live in hypotheticals, but I think that one of the things gay professionals, those out and in the closet, grapple with is some sense of connectivity to people who are going through the same thing. If you knew that, if you both had known that you were gay, or if you project to the challenges that people in a similar situation confront today, how do you think that dialogue would unfold? What are the implications for actually having some sense of a mentor or role model in your professional life?
Role models are crucial. When I was working for Frank Rickwood, the last thing I would have ever dreamt of doing would be to actually make a connection.
No.
There was a gap of seniority, well, there was just a gap of fear that maybe I'd got it a bit wrong. I wasn't quite sure what would happen to this information. But today I think things are different in some environments,
Yeah.
but role models are most important because part of what they provide other people is confidence that it's okay to be out, that it's good to be out, that it doesn't get in the way of promotion, that people do have a better life, and you can see it rather than just read about it. You can actually see it through some real person. That's important. That's why I believe role models are essential, and why so much of the book talks about role models. When I was writing the book, I thought we might have, halfway through the book, I thought we might have got to the point of being, if you will, post-gay, that the book might no longer be relevant. And then I started meeting a lot of professionals to be interviewed for the book between 25 and 35. And I was struck by the number of those people who did not want to come out at work. They really believed that it would be a singular damaging event. It would prevent them from being promoted. It would make them exposed to potential bullying. It would make them weak. And therefore they absolutely would not do it. And that's why there were a lot of people who gave us interviews on the basis of, on the understanding of confidentiality. And some were very extreme. When we read back some interviews, we read back an interview to a man who we identified as a banker in London, and he said, "You can't say that. People may know who I am." And it's extreme, but it's part of a set of fears.
Yes. So after you came out, which was this extraordinary event, you received thousands of letters. Can you share with us just reflections on those letters, things that were surprising, inspirational?
A lot of the letters came from straight people who had got into a mess with relationships and they'd been exposed. They said to me, "This is exactly the same. You just change he to she to he, and the same situations occurred. But we didn't get this amount of press coverage because we're straight and you're gay." And that was a very important factor at the time. I have a feeling it's still a factor. They wanted to share with me their experiences, and to a person, to share with me the experience that after a period of time, it all got better, that there was something really to look forward to. I had a lot of people write to me who I'd been in business with who wanted to assure me that they want to carry on, and they thought this was great and I'd have a good and full life, including thousands and thousands of people who worked in BP. In fact, I think over 10,000 instant emails, and in those days emails were a little bit more clumsy than they are today. And then there were a very few people who talked to me in their letters about the tragedy that had befallen them as they came out. The people who'd been to jail before the law changed, people whose lives had been destroyed by other people. And it reminded me that not everything works out well under any circumstances for anything. While we should aspire to make coming out a really great event for everybody, it may not be for everybody. And so it is an individual decision, but on balance it's one people should really do, because the risk-reward is in favor of coming out.
Yes, yes. So we're going to open it up to the audience in just a few minutes. So if you guys have questions and want to move to the mics, feel free to do that. Before we open it up, just one additional question. So, or actually, no, I wanted to follow on that. You met your partner actually shortly after this incident. Can you tell us about that process? And now you're in a committed relationship, right?
It's absolutely extraordinary. So while everything changed, and I changed my job, changed all the activities I was doing, one thing that didn't change was the secrecy of my private address for security reasons. So all the mail came to my business address, and except for one letter arrived at my private address from someone who said, "I've read everything about you. I'm so sorry this all happened. It's really unfair, and people need to, we hope that it gets better in the future. Perhaps you'd like to have a drink with me." So I thought, so first, how did this person get my address? Because nobody had my address. So I didn't know. So then I said, "Absolutely, I'll have a drink with you." And I postponed it 3 times because I was busy doing things. The 4th time, amazingly, he said, "Fine," We had a drink, and we got to know each other, and one thing led to another, and we've been together for over 7 years now. Now, how did he get the address? That was the interesting question. So he used to be a banker, incidentally. He decided against banking and has now gone into he was very, very successful, gone into the restaurant business instead. He likes being attached to things with his hands. So he looked at photographs in the newspapers, and it said that I lived in Chelsea, and there was a photograph outside my apartment building the numbers will blurred out, so for security reasons. Anyway, he said, I know exactly where this building is. I've walked past it. So he then walked past it again, and he said, since the doorbells have no names on, just numbers, he said, why not just write a letter, and if he's not there, it'll be thrown away or returned to me. And so that's how it happened. Little piece of investigative activity.
Right. Excellent, excellent. Yes, we have a question, please.
First of all, thank you for being here and for writing this book. I think it's a really important kind of touch point and thing to understand about what it means to bring your true self and your authentic self to your work. So thank you for that. I'm curious, at a place like Google, I see people around me coming out every day. And it's not that they're in the closet, it's just that as you meet new people in business and they ask you and get to know you and they ask you about your life, you're constantly coming out. And I think Google is hopefully one of those places where it's easier to constantly be coming out. But I could see really traditional corporate type jobs, finance, banking, being in the law field as more difficult places to be constantly coming out, and maybe that's something that keeps people sort of in that closet. What kind of advice would you have to people that are faced with that and need to maybe figure out a way to get over that hump and be their authentic self, no matter how, to your point, conservative the environment might be?
Well, I think if people feel unsafe about coming out, they're not going to come out. And I think it's wrong to push them in the face of what they may see as something really dangerous to them. I think the right way to answer this question is to go back and say, why is it difficult to come out in some companies? And it has to start at the top. It's the tone set by the leader and the follow-up from the tone, the measurement of the impact of the signal she or he is giving. The time people attend to working on inclusion of all sorts, especially LGBT, which is, I think, one of the more difficult, the leading indicator of getting inclusion right. So, and identifying role models on the way to make it possible for people to identify better. If the environment is very hostile, there is no choice but to say, I'm either going to be in the closet or I'm going to find somewhere else to work. And I think people do go and find other places to work where they find themselves unsettled and in an area where they see no solution but to not be themselves. Because everybody really does want to be themselves, but they want to be themselves and part of a society, not separate and an odd thing in society.
Thank you.
Yes, please.
Hi. So another question kind of relating to the idea of tone that you mentioned. A pretty common example of someone who fits in this category would be Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple. And he, in a lot of situations, has sort of indirectly acknowledged his sexuality. He showed up at the Pride March with Apple employees, but on some level, he's still very unwilling to talk about it. It's in all of his interview notes that it's not to be discussed. So, on one hand, what do you think that says about the tone that he's setting for the culture at a place like Apple, and also kind of for the industry at large, just in terms of acknowledging it on some level, but not really putting it on the table for discussion?
I don't know Mr. Cook. I knew his predecessor, but I don't know Mr. Cook. So forgive me, I'm not going to comment on him. But what I might comment on is leaders generally. It's possibly true that for most people, coming out is a matter of personal choice. The sadness which I feel about myself is that when you're a leader, there isn't that choice. You've got to demonstrate that you're authentic. You have to come out. Otherwise, why would anybody else? They feel it's not quite on the agenda. So I think you have to demonstrate by being authentic yourself. That is very important. I think the second thing is that people have to come out several times. obviously when you're changing jobs, people discover your sexuality again and again, or you might tell them as you go from one company to the next. When people become CEOs, I've observed in the limited number of cases where people have come out, they have to be comfortable in their job, that things are going okay, and then they'll come out again in the position of CEO. It's not an immediate reaction. So I think it's a progress of coming out. But in the end, it's really important to have the biggest role models available. I'm the most senior business person ever to be identified as gay, I believe. And this is not a description I want to have for very much longer. I'd much prefer someone who's running a big company today to be out and be a big role model.
Yeah, thank you. And would you also add that same sort of sense of obligation and setting the tone applies for people in the political world?
Yes. Politicians are doing okay. More and more politicians are coming out. The cynic would say it's dangerous for them not to, because their authenticity would be questioned. They'll be pilloried in the press. But people feel comfortable coming out today, and voters seem to be accepting of sexuality as a non-issue in many, many parts of, at least many parts of Europe and the USA.
Thanks.
Yes.
So Google is one of these young, progressive companies. We have rainbow flags everywhere, from the sign on our building to our Olympic doodles to hidden on our spreadsheet application. You know, we participate in the parade. We have clubs, T-shirts. Does that mean, like, are we good? Do we just wait for the rest of the world to catch up? It feels on some level like there's so much more that we could be doing to advance the normalization of people of all identities and orientations.
There have to be many things. First, being there and demonstrating that you run a company which has no barriers to inclusion, so people can be themselves, is an important point. Seems to me just being there is important. But there's more. People can talk about what it's like to be in an environment where you can be yourself without fear. You can talk to suppliers. Suppliers need to have the same value set, the same practices as Google. Google can influence them. Google can influence by economic nudging countries that it works in. It's not always successful, but I always found that CEOs were given a big list of to-dos, like clean up the environment, fix human rights, make sure that everyone gets a job, increase growth, and increase value, do all of the above simultaneously. But actually, you do bits at different times. And when you meet people who run countries or influential in a country, you can say, well, of course, I'm putting a gay leader here. They're very good, and I want you to know that. And if I can't, then I might not be here. So a little push here and there from substantial corporations is very powerful, because they can't be ignored. Governments, of course, can sanction and do things they rarely do, but corporations can do bit by bit pushing.
Thank you.
Yes.
Resonated for me when you were speaking before about the experience of being in the closet, and that teaches you certain things in terms of being circumspect and gauging situations, just kind of being trained to do that as part of your normal life, and how that can be advantageous in business. I wonder, sometimes I say to myself, hey, Chris, you don't have to be that way anymore in business. I wonder, have you had any similar experiences where you had ways of being which you learned, where you realized for yourself, this is actually disadvantageous now in business?
Good question, with no real clear answer. I believe what I do is discipline myself not to behave in a way which dissembles about me. I will not, in all cases, use it as the opening line, and neither would anybody. But when someone says, "Do you have a wife?" I say, "No, I have a male partner." I'm clear about it. I don't avoid questions. And that is something which is very important to me. I still read people. I still think about what is the right way to negotiate. I still try and never give any signal about what I'm thinking. It's a skill, in negotiation.
And poker.
And poker. So I do all of those things because they're good things. But what I don't do is dissemble about myself.
Thank you.
Yes, Lisa.
Hi, I want to thank you so much for being here. I think this is such an interesting discussion. Recently, during Pride Week, Kim Stoltz came to speak here, and she got a question about being a out queer woman in the corporate world. She is most famously a former contestant on America's Next Top Model, less famously a VP of Equity Derivatives Trading at Credit Suisse. And her argument is that actually being out and queer in finance had actually only benefited her because at this point, so many large corporations are so desperate for diversity, particularly the financial sphere, that she is like a very valued member of her team and an interesting bastion and symbol of kind of a new age of business. I guess I'm just wondering what your reaction is to that, because I feel like a lot of this discussion is about the more negative side of coming out, the fact that it's a personal decision. And I was kind of interested to hear from her that she thought it was only positive and the future is going to move towards it actually being a point of empowerment for some employees.
If I've said this is all negative, don't believe me. I believe it's a very important and powerful thing to come out, because you're just going to be a better person. You're going to be more relaxed. You're going to use your mind and your skill on what you're doing, rather than half of it figuring out how not to be who you are, which is complicated. With inclusion comes a very high standard of merit, I believe. If that doesn't work, then the whole idea of including people on an equal basis begins to corrode. I want to make sure, at least from my point of view, that people get jobs because they're qualified to do that, as I'm sure, incidentally, she is. But it's not about their sexuality. We don't have quotas for sexuality, I don't believe, and neither should we.
Thank you. I was just interested to hear your reaction, because I myself had a somewhat similar reaction. I don't love thinking of myself as a diversity hire, someone who's filling a box, but at the same time, I was like, you know what? Take what you can get. It's kind of empowering.
Well, it's
in a
true,
strange
but
way.
I would say, but remember the consequences of taking what you can get.
Very true. Thank you.
And that's actually a great segue. I mean, part of the title of your book is Why Coming Out is Good for Business. You devote a chapter to that question. Obviously, there are themes throughout the book. Give us the synopsis of your thinking on why it is good for business.
First, when businesses do the right thing, usually they're pretty good businesses. So when they have values that make sense, chances are they've got a lot of other things going for them that give them greater chance of success. Secondly, engaged staff, engaged teams are better teams. They're not wandering around saying, actually, I've got to think about something else, I've got to think about myself. I'm going to be engaged with the team. And engagement takes many forms. When you work with people, you do have to know a little bit about them. We are not machines. At least I don't think we are machines yet. We're not machines.
We're working on that, actually.
Well, I just checked why I thought I'd ask you. So there is an empathy which has to be built up in a high-performance team. And by being out, you can be more engaged. Thirdly, the numbers show it. I'm very struck by all these studies which show hugely different returns, much better returns, when you have engaged staff. That, of course, covers everything from gender, race, all sorts of things.
Right.
But actually, LGBT is one of those litmus tests which says if you get that right, chances are a lot of things are going to fall in place if you really work on this particular, more complex area.
Yeah, well, there's that great example in the book where there's a career fair. And it's an LGBT career fair. And there are all of these Asian women coming up and getting information on the actual environment or whatever. And the recruiters were just baffled because they were like, all of these people cannot be gay. It's like statistically impossible. And it turned out that they were interested in this company. I forget the company, but they were interested in it because they said, if you figured out how to deal with LGBT issues, then in terms of any other diversity metric, be it race or gender, you absolutely, are on the cutting edge. So I thought that was a pretty interesting observation.
It's one which I believe holds water too.
Yes.
I think when you have to think about inclusion as something which is on everybody's agenda, you change the way a firm is led and managed. I've led lots of teams, and when you say to a team, well, we're going to do something, and they say something new and more, most managers come back to you and say, now you've given me 88 things to do, the 89th, where does that go? What do you do with it? And here's where you need to work hard. You need to create the time and space for people to work on the area of inclusion, especially with LGBT activity. And I always say to people, most CEOs say that people are the most important asset in a company. And if that's the case, then they should be spending their most important time on people.
Yes.
Which would normally mean, let's say, half their time on people. Most people don't do that. Maybe they should, and that would make things very much better.
Yeah, and I think there's an amazing insight for me from the book, which we talk a lot about diversity. We do that a lot here at Google, but you make the very clear distinction between diversity and inclusion. So you can have an amazing amount of diversity, but if you don't have a dynamic and a commitment to inclusion, it's almost for naught.
That's right. That's right. It is, the operative part is inclusion. The outcome is diversity.
Yes. So there is sort of a final question that I have, but before I get to that, we'll take another one from the floor.
Hi. I was wondering if you can talk more about coming out to your family, because I've actually found coming out at work actually like the easiest part. Yeah.
So I failed to do it. I tried, and I realized that I was coming up with my mother against these key principles of a secret is a secret you keep to yourself, don't become a part of a minority. She really didn't want to hear. Did she know? She was smart enough to have figured it all out. She must have done.
They always do.
Mothers always know.
They always know. And my father died when I was really quite young. So it was not a topic we talked about. Interestingly, I've met a few, but rather surprising parents while I've been talking about my book. Only last week, I was in Henley on Thames in the UK at a book fair, a very conservative, rather nice part of the UK. And I had two, not one, a set of middle-aged couples come to me and said, could you sign this book to our son? We'd like him to come out. And I thought that was an extraordinary reversal of role.
Thank you.
think that speaks to the power of what you've done. So you also do an amazing job of framing all of the dynamics around gay rights around the world, from the US to Uganda to Russia to all sorts of places around the world. And you provide a really interesting and provocative point of view around the tension that exists between the progressive experience that we have in a place like the US and the subculture of a place like Google compared to other places in the world where there's a lot more work to do. What is your projection for the future? In general, my take from the book is that you're very optimistic, but given all of these challenges that we have around the world and the vigilance that we need to hang on to, what's your projection 10 years out for gay rights? How should we think about that? What can we individually do to continue the charge?
I'm optimistic, even sometimes in the face of data which should make me pessimistic
Right.
in this area. Half the nations where being gay or promoting homosexuality, doing a gay act is illegal, were former members of the British Empire. I guess we exported the laws and we failed to export the update. So they're stuck with these laws of the past. And they're in one category where I think they can be worked on bit by bit, and I know many people are trying to do that to change these laws.
Yes.
There are others where it is part of partly an economic war on a minority, partly it's to gain popular votes, and those areas need, I think, economic pressure, slow but gentle economic pressure. It's not just business, it's the World Bank, it's IMF, it's the lending arrangements, it's all part of a package of human rights. And LGBT rights are human rights. They are, and they need to be in the same category as the general suite of human rights. So we should rely on people and push them to maintain vigilance, to do something about it. I suppose one of the big problems is, and I've worked in many countries where, in a variety of areas, laws are in place and they're enforced selectively. This puts everybody on edge, whether that's on environmental matters, on financial matters, on LGBT. And that is the most dangerous position to be in. No one is sure, in that case, what is going on, or where the laws have been in place and in abeyance and they suddenly come back for enforcement, which is the case in one or two parts of the Far East. So pressure, I believe things will change as the community of nations gets closer, people keep traveling, ideas keep exchanging. These things have a habit of ironing out. Problem is, how long will it take? And that I don't know.
Please join me in thanking Lord John Browne.